Good day, good morning, good evening. This is Preston Smith, your host, with the three things courtesy of The Corners. That's www.thecorners.pl and CDDI, www.cddi.pl. And what is that? Well, that's what I do in my real job, which is working as a detective, a consulting detective, kind of like Sherlock Holmes in Central Europe. So if you have needs like that, then get in touch. We are coming to you from MRP Studios on the Praga side of Warsaw. I gotta say, really cool studio, really cool stuff. I dig the black and white thing. That was actually Evgeny's idea back there. He's kind of the genius behind that. Before I go any further, like and subscribe. I really appreciate you guys watching. We've had a few thousand views on the last video. We're getting a lot of views. We've got a lot of subscribers, but we need more and we need your support. Now, I know you're going, okay, Preston, that's enough. What is the subject? What are the three subjects? Because usually we do three things. What are the three subjects for today? Well, number one, prostitution. Yeah, we're going to talk about prostitution and the good, the bad, and the ugly, and what happened to the kind of the online sites that were promoting this, and what's the story behind that. Actually, just in the bizarro world that is my world as an investigator, I know a lot about this, not because I'm going with prostitutes. Let's make that clear. I know a lot about this for other reasons, which I will explain. Now, and before we get into that, I'm joking about this a little bit because thanks to this entire crazy world that I've lived in for years and years as an investigator, some of the things are kind of funny, but I do want to say, just going into that subject, that I actually don't find it funny, even if I make jokes about it, so you understand. But anyway, the second thing, Dritan R. Now, we talked about Dritan R, however you want to pronounce it. The guy who was the alleged head of Kompania Bello. He was busted in Turkey. We're going to talk about this guy, true crime, and this is actually a pretty big deal when it comes to, yes, once again, the cocaine trade to Europe. And then finally, the Ukrainian war update. A lot of things happening. No, they're not all good, but there is some progress. It's not all bad. We're getting into the winter. Things are getting difficult, but there is actually a lot of news there, and we're really going to go through the maps today. That was a request. I appreciate that request from AR. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to get into the letters today because we've got a lot to cover. And actually, yeah, let's get right into it. Now, the first thing, yes, prostitution. I can't help but doing that. It's actually, it's not a funny subject, but it's one of those subjects that, whenever you talk about it, it exists and people will say, oh, what has to exist? No, it shouldn't exist. It's one of these things that's just, a subject for debate from the very start. But if you look at it logically, you got to wonder why throughout Central Europe, and some countries are different than others, that it's existed for so long, but and it hasn't been clamped down, especially some of the really, the sides where you've got the violence and human trafficking, trafficking women, that kind of thing. But it's not only in Central Europe. So I'm not just picking on Central Europe. I'm not just picking on Poland, although we are going to talk a lot about Poland because I did get actually a couple of questions. I've gotten a bunch of questions on this subject, and I've just sort of skirted around doing it. Actually, I didn't mean to make a pun there. Skirted around talking about this because in some ways it was old news, but it's not old news anymore, frankly, because in Poland, we've had a series of busts. The police busting basically what I call bordellos, houses of ill repute, whatever you want to call them. There was one, I'll just give you a hint. Actually, this week, tomorrow, or the next day, I'm going to put out on the corners just another crime update. I was putting these out more often, but then we had to do the new edition. The new edition, you see it here or here, wherever Evgeny puts it. Obviously, I don't know where he's going to put it, somewhere by my head, the new edition, a picture of it. But the new edition, you may have noticed if you got to the Polish crime blotter that there were these houses of ill repute being shut down. Well, this has continued. And for example, we just saw that the officers from the Rzeszów, from the Central Bureau of Investigation, was kind of like the Polish FBI, supported by officers from the Rzeszów Directorate, plus supported by under the Karpacki branch of the Department of Organized Crime. They busted more of these, and these are actually in the Mazovian province, but they've undertaken raids in Warsaw and Torun, and in one they arrested 3 people that were running basically a brothel. They took like 40,000 watts. They seized like 40,000 watts, a bunch of jewelry, etc. And we've had a series of these, and some people who actually kind of watch the crime scene here were going, well, that's funny. Why are these happening now? A few reasons for that. We're going to go back in time now and talk about this. But one of these reasons, maybe I'm theorizing here just a bit, but I don't think so, goes back to the shutting down of some of these internet sites. Specifically, there was a couple. There was one that was called Odloty.pl and then Roksa. I actually don't really know. Really, I don't. But these were these sites where women could advertise their services. Okay. Now, there's a backstory there. I'm going to get into the backstory, and then we're going to get into what happened last year and give you an idea of the scale of the problem and kind of the whole Odloty and the internet thing surprisingly lasted a long time. That site featured thousands and thousands of women, brothels, strip clubs too, massage parlors, all kinds of stuff that was on there. And what would happen is people would get on that site, Johns that would use the site, they would get on there and they would select what they wanted, and then there were offers, and the price ranges probably ranged from, I don't know, hundreds zlotys to thousands of zlotys for high-class call girls, whatever. Now, I know you're going, oh, Preston, you seem to know a lot about this. I'll give you a little backstory why I do. There's a couple of reasons why I do, so don't you start giving me a hard time with that. But if we go way back, I'm going to give you a kind of some insight into that world. Now, way back in say 2002, 2003, somewhere around there, I was running a magazine, and you would, at that time, even and before that time, when you came into Warsaw, well, you kind of didn't have the internet developed so much yet, right? So you'd come into Warsaw and you used to see these red lights everywhere. You'd see like on Jerozolimski, you'd see these buildings. They weren't very nice kind of tenements, but in between, people were living there, but in between these apartments, you'd have apartments have these red lights and lots of red lights. It was like, kind of a demented Christmas type situation. And you would see not only there, but in other parts of town, tons of these apartments lit up with red lights. Well, these were these kind of small bordellos. Now, anybody that lived in Central Europe at that time or before that time, and man, back in the Czech Republic, it was, gosh, some of those stories I could tell you. It was pretty crazy, but you would see this, and it was just very well known that it was still, especially before the EU, kind of the Wild East. There was lots of prostitution. There tended to be across the whole region. It would be, it's because of all these expats. These foreigners coming here, and they got all this money, and that's what's driving prostitution. No, that's not all of it. I tell you that. And one reason why I know is because there was so much of it. You would also see it on the highways, where you'd see these women standing on the highways. You can still see that in some places in Poland and other countries in Central Europe. These tirówki, they call them. There was so many of this. There's so much talk. So we decided at the time we're going to do a magazine article about it. Now, maybe I'll get into. I ended up interviewing a guy that one of these mafia guys that ran one of these big popular bordellos. It's a crazy story, but at the time, what we did do, in the way I looked at it, said, okay, I want to find out what these women think, because you would hear all the time from people that men and women. It wasn't just men, because you would hear, these girls, they like to do this, and you're like, really? And so we're going to interview a bunch of prostitutes, see what they say. Now, I'll tell you right now, I'm not sure how many we interviewed. We interviewed quite a few, really, and only one said that she liked the work. She didn't really say she liked the work. She said she appreciated the pay. So first, let's get that out of our head, that they liked the work. Almost every single one said it's disgusting. Another thing that was really interesting was at the time, I said, well, look, aren't you worried, diseases? Because, condoms, that's not going to protect you from everything. She said, no, you know what you do? You get this antibacterial gel and you just use tons of it and you cross your fingers. And I was like, okay. Didn't sound very safe to me. But one of the things that they all said at that time, which is something to keep in mind before, I'm not going to rant about prostitution right now, was just that constantly they were asked for, John would ask, can we have sex without a condom? And a lot of them, they would take extra money and agree. And you're just like, man, this is just biological disaster waiting to happen. And you can see this across the world. Maybe one day we'll get into, I talked to you one time during that, actually back then, I interviewed a couple of doctors, and they were telling me about the problems they're afraid of and what they're worried about happening, and scary stuff. But at that time, around that time, so I published this article, and it got read. A lot of people read it at the time, then a couple things happened. One thing happened is that some of these crazy business people I know, they started ringing my phone at late at night, going, Preston, do you think I have AIDS? I was like, man, I don't know if you have AIDS. And my wife's like, what the hell? And that was one thing that happened. But the other thing that happened was there was a guy that approached me about that time. And again, remember, the internet was here and it was developing and people were putting websites up, but it wasn't that big yet. And this guy approaches me and he says, hey, Preston, you know all about prostitution. I go, man, I don't know all about prostitution. I just wrote one article. But he said, what do you think about this? He said, I'm going to create a website. And so these girls, because this guy went with a lot of prostitutes, he goes, these girls that will be able to advertise themselves on the website, and that way they don't have to have a pimp, and people will be able to like reserve times with them through the website and whatever. And I was like, man, are you nuts? I go, if you get into that, for sure, organized crime's going to come down on your head. Second, it's like you're going to be a pimp. One day you'll go to jail. And he goes, oh, no, you're being too pessimistic, whatever. And besides, I've got some guys that work with me on it. I was like, well, I can't imagine who they are, but I could. And this was something I thought, man, this is not going to end well. Well, I ran into him sometime later, and he said, oh, well, and I guess it got a bit too scary too fast, and so he didn't do it. So this is for you. You know who I'm talking about if you're watching this, because even though this other guy, actually Henrik, what is his last name? Henrik K, I believe that was his name. The guy who created Odloty, he created this in 2008. They think he probably earned, probably not him just alone, around 40 million watts off this. This guy Henrik, is it Henrik K? I'm going to check this and make sure. I think it's Henrik K. Henrik K was arrested back in 2022. Okay. And a couple of months later, now that was actually when suddenly Odloty and there's some other services like this, they were just shut down. They disappeared. And if you find the articles, you can find the articles in Polish, and you'll even see, like in Gazeta Wyborcza, talking about the end of an era. This is over, which is kind of a funny way to put it, to tell you the truth. But yeah, Henrik K, right? Now, Henrik K is looking at 7.5 years in prison. He had a huge fine to pay, like bail, like $300,000. The police think that maybe he made 40 million, or at least the people he was working with made 40 million off these women. That kind of gives you an idea of the scale of this, because according at least to the press and what the police said, the women would pay about 50 zlotys a month to be on these sites. So you kind of get an idea. Now, actually, I have a little bit of a better idea, because I had an NGO type approach me, and they said, we're very worried about, the scale of prostitution and what's happening with women and sex trafficking and all that. Would you be interested in doing kind of a pro bono project to give us more insight on this. And I said, well, as a detective in a detective agency, I rarely do pro bono because I just can't afford it, right? But we'll take a look at it and come back to you and give you a price and see what we can do. Well, we took a quick look at it, and I was, to tell you the truth, I was pretty shocked at how many women were on this site. And I mean, literally, if there were, I'd be surprised if there weren't 20,000. Okay. Now, here's the thing. The big question, and the big question was, how did this go on for so long? And you would get this, I got this question from way back in the early 2000s all the way to now. How was it that this went on? And so I'm going to give you a couple of answers here and why it happened, and also one more kind of story from the old days. The way that it used to work, okay, and this was kind of the excuse you constantly heard, is why the police can't shut it down. The way it used to work was the organized crime groups, what they would do is they would sometimes even find like an old lady who owned kind of a big apartment. And back then that was actually more common than you think. You know, now as time has gone on, apartments became so valuable, people sold these things, but there were times when there were these apartments that were actually surprisingly big. Like, I'm not talking 100 square meters, I'm talking 200 square meters, 250 square meters, whatever. And so what would happen is they would find the owner, and sometimes it was an older, like maybe an older woman. That's who the mafia was trying to find, because they were a good target to become the madame, right? Now, this woman who owned that apartment, she wasn't really acting like a madame. She was basically just renting the premises. And what the mafia, what the crime groups would do is they would find these girls, and sometimes they were coerced, sometimes they weren't. I'll talk about that in a minute. And these women would basically rent rooms from this woman in this big apartment. And then what would happen is the women would pay the woman rent basically based on how many Johns were coming through. If the police raided, the argument was, well, the girl can do whatever she wants in her own room, because actually prostitution in itself, a woman taking money for sexual services herself, was not illegal. Being a pimp was illegal, and so the organized crime groups were getting around it in this fashion. Now, obviously, it didn't take, you didn't have to be a brainiac to figure out what was really going on, because even though they, technically they found this way to do this, this was still pimping, especially because a lot of times what you would see is that the different criminal groups, they would do this whole thing where they would have like kind of a face jock skirting around in the small towns. He would meet young, usually girls, maybe they haven't finished high school, they're not going to finish high school, single moms, whatever, tell them, hey, come do this. Actually, you don't have to be a prostitute, you can just be the girl at the desk, et cetera, et cetera. But then once they got into it, they along the way, a lot of times they'd give them like a mobile phone, and then they would take that mobile phone and they would find out, they would basically hack the system, or that's a whole different story. But they would use the mobile phone to find out all about this girl, her parents, who she was calling, and then they would blackmail her and say, if you actually try to leave or you don't agree to this, then we're going to call your mom, we're going to call your dad, we're going to talk to your grandparents, whatever. And some of these girls, because they'd started this and they realized, hey, it's no fun and games, but then they're already in it, they were blackmailed, they would continue. That was kind of one of the way it used to work in the old days. Now, clearly, something was wrong that this kept going on, because prostitution is one of these things that you don't really keep secret, because if you keep it secret, then the Johns can't find out where it is. And then this took on this whole nother dynamic when it came to Odloty and this Roksa, whatever, and some of these other sites where these women were advertising. Now, and here's why, especially with Odloty, because one of the things that we noticed when we checked it out, and I have to say that one of the guys that worked on it was like, yeah, I'll check it out, I'll go through all the pictures. But anyway, when we checked it out, was that Odloty itself was going around, probably, as I understood, the girls would pay more money to get the pictures taken, but they would go and take these kind of glamour shots. And the girls that didn't want to pay that, I guess they would try and kind of take glamour shots. And that whole thing kind of glamorized the business. You see what I mean? Because they were running and they take these glamour shots, they put them on there, it convinces the Johns that these women are crazy beautiful, and I'm sure some of them were really pretty, but this whole thing, this whole myth, and that's kind of what one of the things that was such a horrible thing with Odloty, because it was sort of convincing a lot of young and vulnerable women and single moms and foreign women that were coming here, maybe from the East, whatever, that this was maybe, something more glamorous and less dangerous than it was. Now, on the flip side, there was this other argument, which was kind of a weird argument, and I never really, didn't really believe it, but the argument was that because the women were signing up and paying Odloty in part, and this was assumed to be part of a larger group with this maybe mafia umbrella, and they had their photos on it, that they were kind of safer from like street pimping and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. I think the bad outweighed the good, but anyway. Now, we go one step further. Why are all these busts happening now? Because I just mentioned this one here in Warsaw and also in Toruń, where they're busting these basically a pimping organization. They're shutting them down, but they're also they've been busting in other cities, especially down kind of in Silesia, in that part of Poland. A couple things. One, maybe Poland, and not only Poland, because we've seen this kind of thing in other countries in Central Europe, just moving forward. The kind of crazy old days and kind of the insanity and a lot of the stuff that was going on back then. People were sick of it. They don't want their daughters trapped into it, etc. There's that whole thing of transition Europe, and I kind of look at it differently. That Europe, a bunch of countries in Europe, where they're not going to see their daughters used like that anymore. Okay, that might be more of the thing. But there's another issue. One is that suddenly there is the will. Now, going back to the early 2000s and saying it was impossible for the police to make these busts, that's not really true, and I'll tell you exactly why. At the time, I also interviewed the late Lech Kaczynski, who was once president of Poland. Before he became president of Poland, he was mayor of Warsaw. Okay, so when we did this story, I was actually interviewing him for another reason. It was politics, but I threw in this question because we were working on this story at the same time, and I said, look, what do you think about, you come into Warsaw and you got all these red lights and all that kind of thing, and he just went ballistic. He didn't like it. I liked Lech Kaczynski. I thought he was a pretty good dude. He was, I think he was very moral. I think he was quite sincere. He wanted to lead Poland. He was quite old by the time he became president. And you can talk about peace, and you can not like peace, whatever. But as a person, I thought he was I did like him. I thought he was a good guy. Well, he went ballistic. He said, that's the end of that. You know what? Right after that, there were a number of these brothels that started getting shut down. I even saw one because it was near where we worked, and they kicked a couple of Johns out. Literally, one of them was like holding his clothes in his hands and like just wearing his underwear. I don't know why they didn't arrest those guys, but they did start shutting some of those down. So when there was a will, there was a way. But if we ignore all that and we jump to now, what's going on? Think about this. You've got a website, and there were more than one, and apparently they've all been shut down now. But Odloty is the one that was kind of one of the biggest ones. Anyway, it's the one that we were tasked to at least scope. In the end, we didn't do the job because we didn't get paid. But you have a site that's just got tens of thousands of women on it. The guy running it, he's busted for pimping on a grand scale. But think about this. They have been collecting from all these women. They have every single location and site basically in Poland where you had organized prostitution, and also just you didn't have to be part of a group if you're a woman. You could just pay and you could be on the site, or you could be part of a larger group. But think of the massive amount of intelligence that the police have from that. My theory is that they're still going through it, and they're looking not for the women, because the women in one respect or another are still victims, but they're looking for the organized crime groups. And I think we're going to be seeing more and more and more of these busts. And frankly, there have been a lot over the last few months. There have been a lot over the last few months. So that is my brief first thing dip into prostitution. That's probably enough. Maybe we'll get into some of this other stuff later, because there's more tangents here. Prostitution's one of these drivers, one of these things, always it's part of organized crime. And you can't separate it from human trafficking. You just can't, because locally, you basically from town to town, from site to site, you get into this type of thing. You even get, like I said, this glamorization of it. I've had more than one client show up and say, look, my wife is getting into this stuff, or my ex-wife is now trying to be one of like professional girlfriends, kind of the sort of like, I don't want to say Instagram, but well, kind of Instagram, this type of thing. And that kind of that Odloty glamorization of this, I think, was driving some of that too. Maybe we'll get into that in another show. That's enough about prostitution for today. Let's get into the second thing, which is the big bust of Dritan R, who, in some people called him the king of cocaine, in Europe anyway. Now, the second thing, the big bust of Dritan R, the head of Kompania Bello, king of cocaine, or one of the kings of cocaine, because there are a lot. We've talked about the different, different kings of cocaine, everyone from Titondino to the Kinahans, to all kinds of, the super cartel, the Camorra aspect, et cetera, et cetera. But there has always been an Albanian aspect. And when you get into the Albanian aspect and the violence involved, it just, man, even for me, it's like, sends shivers down my spine. That's not why I'm wearing a hat, actually, today. I'm wearing a hat because it's cold and slushy in Poland, and I've been sick again, getting sick again. I probably need to go somewhere warm. But let's talk about what happened. Now, on November 10th, Dritan R, I'm just going to put in, that's what you do in Poland when it comes to last names. You just use the last initial. That's according to the law, so that's why I'm doing that here. Dritan R was arrested in Istanbul. This is a big, big deal. Called the king of cocaine. He is notorious also in Ecuador, but also in Italy, also in Albania, because this guy is someone who is considered very dangerous, as well as his entire gang. Now, when we get into this whole king of cocaine moniker, in Kompania Bello, and look, there's no way to actually say who is the king of cocaine, right? We've talked about, like I said, Titondino. We've talked about this super cartel that Titondino was allegedly part of with the Kinahans. We've talked about this whole Montenegro, the Kotor mafia, the Skaljaris and the Kavac and the war and all that. The fact of the matter is just tons of cocaine that's been coming to Europe from all different directions. And a lot of times these different gangs cooperate, even if maybe on the top level it might not seem that way, but so many are broken into tiny cells, right? Maybe you're even talking about the Moroccan mafia, the Moco mafia, or the Macro mafia. I've seen it listed both ways. They're in so many different cells, and they were cooperating. One of the ways they were cooperating was what we talked about with these encryption services, and now these encryption services have gone down. Obviously, I'm talking about SkyECC, but it's something that we just see one bust after another bust, and more information and more, and suddenly now, on November 10th, we've got this arrest of Dritan R. Now, the crazy thing in some ways is that he came to Europe, or he went to Turkey. He was using a falsified Colombian passport, supposedly under the name of Benjamin Omar Perez Garcia, which seemed pretty convincing, I guess. But he wasn't arrested at the airport, as I understand. They tracked him. The Turkish police tracked him. They hit his hideout. They seized, different materials, as they always do, but they busted him and they made a big deal about it. Pictures of this showed up in the Daily Mail in Britain, which the Daily Mail repeats like every drug story that, hey, you can order cocaine just like ordering a pizza. They always say that. Maybe that's true. However, that they're making a big deal about this is not an over-exaggeration. I'll tell you something about the Daily Mail, which I know some of the Brits will, oh man, the Daily Mail, oh, no cup of tea for you. But the fact is, their crime stuff, from what I've seen, when I've seen it and I've compared it to they've actually pretty much on par, and they get good pictures, and I think they work hard on the crime stuff. So I'm not saying read it for politics or I'm not saying to even read it. I'm just saying that, when they get into the crime stuff, it's not that bad. But they busted Dritan R. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is kind of, maybe we should be laying bets on how long it's going to take before he escapes, because I want you to listen to this. This is just kind of, in a lot of these guys, you'll find that a lot of these big drug kingpins, they do make their escapes again and again and again. In fact, I'm going to highlight another guy who's a big player. I'm not even going to tell you who it is. You can read it. I'm going to put in the crime update tomorrow. This is Sunday night, November. Is this the 18th? What is it? I don't even know what day it is today. What day is it, Evgeny? It's today the 18th? November 18th?
Yeah.
Yeah, today's the 18th. So tomorrow you'll get your crime dosage, but probably the show will come out on Tuesday. That's just how it goes. That's how long it takes us to put this together, because we work really hard to make you happy and give you true crime. Now, a lot of these guys manage to escape a lot, probably because there's a lot of drug money involved. But check this out. This is kind of amazing. 2006, he's arrested, and because he was also he was a suspect in the murder of a policeman, killing a couple of cops actually, and cocaine trafficking and all kinds of things. 2006, he's in Duras in Albania, and supposedly the story was that somebody left the jail door open, and he walked out. When a cop asked him a question, he said, "Oh, they're done with me," and he just walked out the door and he disappeared. Obviously, kind of hard to believe that one, I don't know. But then he winds up getting arrested in Italy, and somehow he manages to escape from prison in Milan in 2011 with 2 other inmates. Then he's rearrested in Spain. The Spanish are really good at catching everyone from the Vori, the Zacconi, the thieves-in-law, to mafia thugs, Camorra, whatever. You go to Spain, if you're a mafia thug, I wouldn't recommend it, because they do arrest people. They find you and they bust you, unlike in a lot of other countries. He's extradited to Belgium. he goes to Belgium, and he's put in a prison in Antwerp, which for some reason prison in Antwerp sounds pretty hard to escape from. Nope, he escaped from there too, right? And then what happens? He winds up back in Ecuador. And here the Albanian mafia in Ecuador, the drug mafia, these guys have a horrible reputation. This goes, you can see this in the Daily Mail too, but not only. If you're an American and you're used to following the whole drug trade and the drug wars, Mexico, South America, Central America, etc., Ecuador will come on the radar, because it's one of those places there's been a ton of violence, and a lot of it has been blamed on the Albanian mafia. And yes, in that, I'm going to cite the Daily Mail article. I'll put a link there. That's not the only one, though. Prosecutors threatened, people murdered, all kinds of stuff, and they blame it on Kompania Bello a lot of times. Now, he's thrown in prison in Ecuador, right? He was supposed to serve 13 years for drug trafficking, and then 2 years ago, for some reason, a judge just decided, yeah, you get out early, I guess parole. I actually don't know if it was officially parole, but a judge let him out. And the thing that was so crazy about this, when the judge let him out early, is that Albania, because he escaped from Albania, right? He was supposed to serve 25 years there. And Italy, who wanted him for narco trafficking, were trying to extradite him to their countries to charge him there. So they're really, okay, so maybe you serve this, you finish this sentence early for good behavior, but you should be extradited. That's the way it kind of ought to work. You'd think it'd work like that. It wasn't. This isn't the first time. You can't just look at Ecuador and blame them, because remember we talked about Tito and Dino, right? And Tito G in the Tito and Dino gang, that back in April suddenly was released. The Dubai authorities had arrested him, and they just let him go, even though the Dutch especially were trying to get him extradited, tying that gang into some of the craziness that was happening in Holland, which I've covered in the past. But to tell you the truth, Dritan R, he manages to escape very, very often. Now, why do I think that Dritan R, why do I think that he was arrested now? How did the Turks do it? Well, there's a couple of things that you should know about the Turks. They you know, forget politics. Let's not talk about politics. Let's not talk about that. That's not what I'm talking about right now. When you talk about the police in Turkey, they have traditionally been quite good at getting intelligence, at going after organized crime leaders, and that includes the Vori. I mentioned the Vori Zakoni, the thieves-in-law, the Russian thieves-in-law. And maybe we'll talk about some of these arrests, go back to some of these things that have happened in the not-so-distant past, really prior to COVID. But you had a number of Vori, these thieves-in-law that were in, say, Armenia, the stands, but also up in Russia fighting on the big open-air markets. I'm thinking actually right now of Guli. And then when Russia, at the same time the U.S., but that had nothing to do with it really, when Russia and Putin, they decided we've kind of had enough of these guys because we can't control them, the Brothers Circle and the Common Fund, I've talked about it in the past, they started in Russia passing legislation to say, if you're involved in one of these rackets, we're just going to throw you in jail and that's it. But also you saw kind of some of the other stands following suit, or Armenia following suit. So suddenly these guys started migrating west. At the same time, there were a number of gang wars. And for example, Guli, who I just mentioned, he ended up getting on the wrong side of some of the other Vori, who some of them considered him not to be a true Vori because maybe he had different passports, whatever. And he was one of these that he went to Turkey, and there were others that went to Turkey, and then there were assassination squads that went to Turkey. And the Turks were kind of amazing because they would come in and bust these guys and even keep guys from getting assassinated because they bust the assassins. Their level of intelligence when it comes to organized crime is actually quite fascinating. So I'm not surprised that Dritan R got arrested in Turkey. And interesting, and you got to give kudos to the Turkish police here, is they didn't just grab him at the airport. Look what they did. They tracked him, they found his hideout, they arrested him there. I imagine there are other guys that are going to go down here, and yeah, he might now get extradited to Italy. Italy's really after him because there are alleged ties between Kompania Bello, obviously the various Italian mafias. Some say, off the top of my head, I can't remember, some say it's Camorra. I'll leave it at that because I actually don't focus that much on the Italian mafia. But this is actually quite something, and I'm pretty sure it also goes back to, yeah, the Sky ECC bust and all that once they bust the encryption. So, are the authorities working to stop this flood of cocaine to Europe? Yes, they are. Is it stopping the flood of cocaine to Europe? No, it isn't, but it's not for the lack of trying, and we're going to see more busts in the future. Now, let's turn from organized crime. We talk about prostitution, cocaine. How much can you take in just one day? I don't know, maybe you want to hear more about that. But let's go on to the third thing, which is, yes, our weekly War in Ukraine update. All right, let's get into the War in Ukraine update, the weekly update. Now, I'm going to give a caveat here, as I always do, just to let you know that I'm coming from a pro-Ukrainian standpoint. However, I'm trying to be objective and also not sugarcoat this stuff because things are getting tough and I think they are going to get tougher. Does this mean I think that Ukraine has to lose or will lose? No, I'm not saying that. But I am saying that we need, the West especially, kind of needs to figure out where they stand. What we really are seeing, just if we're going to, summarize it, crystallize it, is now it seems that there are indeed more and more questions about how Ukraine is going to get the funding, how they're going to continue the war. And you've got this kind of continued schizophrenic outlook. One is that on the one hand, where in the U.S., the Biden administration seems very committed to supplying Ukraine. But then when you look at Congress, as we have talked about in the past, not so excited about just giving an open check. In fact, it looks like the amount is going to be much reduced. But then we have Europe talking about supplying more money to Ukraine. But then you look at that track record, you kind of have to wonder, and now winter's coming, etc. So that's just a kind of a quick prelude to what I'm going to talk about. But let's talk about the Europeans. Just over the last couple of days, you can see the headline, Germany set to double its Ukraine military aid under the Scholz plan. Now, when we talk about Germany and Scholz and the government and what they plan, if you know Olaf Scholz is German chancellor. In the past, they talked about, you know, when the war first started, they talked about a serious amount of money. I can't remember if it was going to be 70 billion or 80 billion. Maybe I have notes here. I don't remember off the top of my head. No, it was 100 billion. After 3 days, actually, this is in the same article. 3 days after after Russia invaded Ukraine, Scholz announced a 100 billion euro fund. Okay, and with 2/3 expected to be allocated by the end of the year. Okay, now that was going to up Germany's defense budget, etc. At the same time, we saw this commitment that has been much talked about recently about 1 million shells going to Ukraine, and then Germany coming out just recently, Scholz coming out and saying, look, we're not going to hit that. We know you're not going to hit it. I think it's at 70% right now. I can tell you right now that if I talk to anyone who goes to Ukraine or is in Ukraine or has any contact with anyone who has any contact with people in the military, or not in the military from a spying type of point of view, soldiers at the front line, the constant message back is we don't have enough ammunition. Okay, so now when I see that Germany is set to double its Ukraine military aid, great news, but that's a plan. Okay, that's a plan. We don't know if that's going to happen yet. This was sort of like when we talked about the Biden plan to send, what was it, 105 billion, and that was not going to happen. I don't know. I'm kind of surprised that he ever said that. Now, at the same time this is happening, what have we seen happen over the last week or two? Well, in Slovakia, under the new Fico government, the Robert Fico government, this is like his 4th time as prime minister. He definitely said, we're not going to send any ammunition to Russia, and their government is holding to that. We know, you know, we've got Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's basically not only saying that, he says that Ukraine, you shouldn't have said that Ukraine could be on any track to join the EU. He's saying they're not ready. Well, I mean, they're getting bombed. You know, the country's under tons of pressure. I mean, it's not, no one's expecting Ukraine to suddenly come in and be the next tiger of Europe. But you know, Orban, at least he has been consistent when it comes to Hungary going against the rest of the West, where some of the countries in the West, they say one thing and they don't do another, or they don't do much of it. So what you got to give at least him 1 point for consistency. In the meantime, Bulgaria, interestingly enough, as we mentioned in the last show, basically kind of hit Serbia and Hungary with this transit gas tax, because they put a tax on transit Russian gas coming through the pipeline that's going to Serbia and to Hungary. And also North Macedonia is complaining about this because they want to up the price so that Russia can't benefit, because let's get into gas economics. We can talk about that a million different ways. So there is a bit, you know, there are different opinions, and you could argue that, yeah, war weariness on the part of the Allies in sending money and funds to the Ukraine is continuing. On top of this, though, there is a fear, and if you follow this at all, you realize this, because you saw what happened last year when Russia targeted Ukrainian infrastructure and basically tried to freeze the Ukrainians. A lot of people in the West got motivated, supported the Ukrainians, sent generators so that they could get through that winter. I was involved in that too with the foundation that sent lots of generators. Well, now this fear has returned, and Russia, if you look at the Russian blogs, you look at comments from Russian officials, it does appear that they're going to try to really target infrastructure and try to freeze Ukraine. And now they're, you know, not just with you know, strikes like drone strikes or the type of strikes we saw in the past, but even with maybe ballistic missiles. So things may get tough in the winter. I don't know what else to say about that. There's no way to sugarcoat that. That's just what we're looking at. Now, on the flip side, though, even though we know there's a chronic shortage of ammunition in Ukraine, there's arguably a shortage of manpower when we get into the thing that the average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now supposedly 40 years old. But something happened this week, which at first, it's easy to just lump this into another Russian official or business leader or military person was, died, mysteriously died, and you just go, ha ha, and you lump it into all that. This is actually interesting. Lieutenant General Vladimir Svidorov, he was kind of considered to be somebody who didn't hold his tongue when he was commander of the 6th Army and the Air Force, the Air Defense of Russia in the past, but he also said things in the present that maybe did not go down well. He was found dead with his wife. Now, this is the kind of thing that he said. He said that that pilots should have 100 hours of flight time before they're actually flying in combat. And he said that the average flight time is actually 25 to 30 hours. So he's sort of giving away some intelligence, and which isn't that much of a surprise, because both sides have taken huge losses when it comes to skilled personnel. True, the Russians can throw in just endless meat for the meat grinder, but you can't just grab somebody out of prison and put them behind the cockpit of a fighter. Or maybe you can. Maybe that's what they're doing. But he also said, and this is according to the Kyiv Post, that the Army was appointing poorly trained officers because you don't have the guys with the skills anymore. Now, this actually, this statement really concurs with a lot of what the Ukrainians have been saying for a while, which has been kind of easy. You could write that off saying it's Ukrainian PR, because the Ukrainian PR machine is actually very, very good. Not only the message, but the presentation, from top to bottom, it's been outstanding. Sometimes I think that's worked against them a little bit, but this type of comment does sort of support exactly what we've been hearing for a while. Now, what's interesting is that Major General Vladimir Popov was supposedly this guy's friend. And he kind of didn't hold back either, because he basically said that this death, in fact, what's the quote? I'm going to find the quote. This is from the Kyiv Post. He said, "When I found out about his death, it hurt my heart. It's a shame that people of such a rank who are worthy of attention and request go out in this way. It seems to me that this was an absurd death." What does that mean? An absurd death. He's not saying he died just of old age, and that the guy's wife died with him just of old age. So again, we do see this type of thing, which you wonder, what does this do to morale? But when you combine these two comments, this is one of these things that kind of should give Ukraine hope, because part of their strategy now, de facto, I think, is going to be hold the line. It's a stalemate. Yes, the counteroffensive didn't achieve everything we wanted it to, but it certainly did punish the Russians. And if you look at like what we talked about last week, that at Avdiivka, it's possible that the Russians have lost 10,000 troops in a month there. 10,000. That's a huge number. That's such a huge number. Now, let's go through the maps and talk about what's going on. And we're going to go this time actually from the north to the south, because yes, Kupiansk is on my mind. Some of you will say, no, we should be talking about the south. We should be talking about Krynki. We will talk about Krynki, but I want to talk about Kupiansk first. So let's go to the maps. Now, first, when we take a look at these maps, here is the big map, just as I always do at the very start. You've got from Kherson all the way, you got Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, then you're going up to Donetsk, and then you're going to go all the way up to the Kupiansk front. You've seen it before. I'm just putting this out there like this right now, because I did have the last one. Maybe I hurried through the last episode. Actually, a friend of mine got in touch with me, and he said, "Hey, you should actually maybe show more on the maps because it's easy to get lost on them." I don't know. Maybe it is easy to get lost on them. But let's go through them map by map. So if we go to this first map and we talk about Kupiansk, right? And I've talked about Kupiansk until my face is blue, although you can't see it when I'm doing it this way, in the past, because there was this big buildup in the Svatovo and Kupiansk front, and they talked about, a huge amount of troops, potentially 200,000 in that whole region. And then we had the Ukrainian push at Robotnya, and they took some of the best experienced troops and the best fighters that would be going on the offensive, and they put them down on Robotnya to stop to stop the Ukrainians from making progress there. And so that slowed down the progress in Kupiansk. But now it appears that they may be ramping up. Now, if you look at this first map, you've got Kupiansk up at the top. You've got those arrows, right? And that, again, once again, we talked about that last time where the Russians are coming down from Liman-Pershi. But you go all the way down to Lysychansk, and you see those arrows down at the bottom. This does not mean that nothing is happening between there. But if we go to the next map, and I'm going to just focus right now on Kupiansk, what we understand to be happening is that there is very serious fighting now. It's not just sort of the what seems to have been happening in the past. Yes, there was a push. It wasn't going very well. The Russians are still pushing. They're getting closer to Sinkivka. But now there's very serious fighting coming down out of Liman-Pershi. But not only, you see these other arrows, like you go down towards Orlyanka, but also there is a serious push even south of Orlyanka at Yahidny. This is actually not something to sneeze at. It's something that we believe the Ukrainians are taking very, very seriously, and they're reacting. They've done a phenomenal job at reacting and keeping that to a stop. If you take a closer look at the next map, however, and you see Liman-Pershi, you see Sinkivka, you see this gray area, and it's all the way right on the edge of Sinkivka. They are pushing hard. Now, Sinkivka is a tiny place, okay? So losing that, I don't think suddenly changes the whole war, but it is a Russian PR victory. And the problem is, if you see Sinkivka and you kind of back out from Sinkivka, you will see that I do think the Ukrainians have been reinforcing this area and everything, but you're not going to see a lot of natural barriers where you could put up trenches, or you could really, you don't want the Russians to have a breakout here. Now, one quick comment, if you're talking about Deepstate UA, they're not going to reveal the Ukrainian fortifications. So don't think that there are not any, but that region up there, you don't want to see a breakout in that region. Now, if you go down further south, we'll go further south, the Russians are also pushing down at Bilohorivka. I'm not going to get too much into that. I don't think there's a whole lot going on there. Go further south from that, and you hit Bakhmut. Now, Bakhmut is interesting because it does appear that the Russians are pushing really quite hard in that area, especially south of Bakhmut, Klishevka and Avdiivka. Now, remember, it was only a few weeks ago when we were talking about the Ukrainians making gains there, and now it looks like the Russians are doing everything they can to try to regain lost territory. And you see on this next map, you got Klishevka, Avdiivka, and I just highlighted the 83rd Separate Guards, but they're coming in north of Klishevka, but we understand that they're also hitting not Avdiivka so much, but more south of Avdiivka. And if you take a look at this topological map, you can see the rail lines. You'd think that in modern day warfare with the types of weapons and the types of armor and all that it would be easy to get back. A rail line wouldn't be like you'd think, yeah, a river is different, right? A lake is different. The sea is different, but the rail line actually is difficult for both sides. And this seems to be the big battle are the Russians going to be able to cross that and move forward? We know they are pushing hard, but let's go further south to Avdiivka, and that is what I really want to talk about. Now, obviously, if you see this map and you see all these arrows of the Russians pushing this Russian offensive, you immediately know, even if this is your first time to focus on the war in Ukraine or to see these maps, that this is a different story. This is where we're talking about this cauldron. We had this, first they talked about Bakhmut basically being the big meat grinder. That was last year. This looks like it's going to replace that as the meat grinder of meat grinders, because the Russians are just throwing everything they have into this. Maybe there was a little bit of a slowdown for a brief point last week, but this picked up again, and it's just meat into the meat grinder. Now, what's interesting here, there are a couple of things, and in a way, I'm wrong, okay? I'll get to that in a minute when we talk about this push in the direction of Berdichi But I'll talk about that in just a sec. Before we talk about why I'm wrong, really I'm talking about Stepove, why I'm wrong, let's talk about what is happening here when you look at this first map. You see Avdiivka, and that's the town, and make no mistake, it's been blasted. If you take a look, if you look to the east, to find that on the map, look at Kruta Bauka, Mineralna, just where those arrows are, okay? Kind of a little bit around the Kruta Bauka area, you've got maybe a little bit, I probably should get more sophisticated and draw exactly what I'm talking about, but you've got this industrial part of Avdiivka. I've seen photos of that. It's just a mess. I mean, it is flat, and the Russians are pushing hard to get in there. But this forms, as often is with the salient. We'll talk about this with Robotnia too. When one side takes a town, they actually make themselves vulnerable in this crazy time of drones and artillery and missiles, and the fact that armor has such a hard time surviving. They make themselves vulnerable to having to go to ground in cities that are not really big cities, and they get completely flattened, and these guys are hiding in the rubble, and it's very hard for them to do very much. And the theory is, and this was my theory weeks back, was that we will see more and more of a pivot off of these. Instead of trying to claim these and hold these and launch attacks from them, which the Ukrainians are still doing, I think we will see more pivoting, which the Ukrainians also did in Robotnia, where they maybe will try just to, okay, instead of trying to roll in and take a town that is just almost worthless in and of itself, they will surround the town or pivot off the town and de facto create a pincer that could trap the defenders of these points and create real problems. Well, this does seem, maybe the Russians unfortunately have been listening to me, I doubt it, maybe they have. This may be exactly what's happening, because you've got a natural pincer that had formed quite some time back, a month ago, up in the top where you see this Krasnohorivka, and down below we've got Vodnyane and you've got Prvomaisk. But interesting, the Russians are not just pushing at the tips of these pincers, they're pushing north and south of these pincers and putting a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians. Now, if we go a little bit, we go into the topological map, and actually I'm going to go one more. So where you see, now just so you keep track, look at Krasnohorivka and you see Berdichi, right? Now I did say this, I'm going to own up to it, that if the Russians take Stepove, then you've got a big problem, and maybe you will see the Ukrainians try to pull out. Now, literally one day after I said that, and I said expect the Russians to take that probably in the next couple of days, the Russians, or at least Russian bloggers and Russian sources, came out and said they took it. Then we heard they didn't take it. Now, if I look at now it's a week later. If we take a look at the Deepstate UA maps, and I look at these apart from just my own sources and taking a look at the open source stuff, the Russian bloggers and Rybar and these kind of guys, apart from just looking at looking and listening to what they have to say, I actually also go back to Deepstate UA because I see these as these guys, they're very good. They're very good at what they do. You've got to give these guys a shout out. And I look at them as a confirmation a lot of times. Now, that doesn't mean that this can be completely accurate, because I think they work to confirm something before they put it up. Some people might say they're pro-Ukrainian, so they don't want to put up stuff. I don't know, but I do look at this as a confirmation. And as you see on this map, you don't see that the Russians have taken Stepove yet, although they are pushing hard, and maybe they took it, they lost it, they took it, they lost it. When I said they were going to take it, if they took it, that the Ukrainians would be really under a lot of pressure, had to pull out. I still stick by that. And if you take a look, I want you to take a look at this, the next two maps, okay? You see in this first map, you've got Stepove, and you see Avdiivka, and you've got this, you can even see this road going into it. That's how the Ukrainians are getting, you see the one I'm talking about. So you've got Lashtokinia, and then you've got Avdiivka, and you see, you can just see this road going down into Avdiivka. That road is like the supply road. There are not a ton of roads, Ukraine was not I mean, not saying undeveloped, but it wasn't the most developed country, and there's lots of farms, and you see the farmland. There's not tons of roads where you can get supplies in and out. And now you've got Ukrainians making these runs in and out, and that's why I was like, if the Russians take Stepovy, and then you just got like farmland, Stepovy, Verdiche, then it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to be able to use these roads to get into Avdiivka, and that's when I would say maybe that's at the time when you expect to pull out. Remarkably, the Ukrainians have not pulled out. They're just making the Russians pay. But there's another interesting side of this. You take a look at the next map where we even concentrate closer onto Stepovy. And here's one that's kind of a weird one, because you see this kind of round blob, okay? That is the infamous Terrakon tailings pile, right? It's kind of like a mountain of mine tailing of waste. And the Russians took that, well, we'd heard a couple weeks ago that they took it, then they didn't take it, they partially took it, whatever. And this was seen as a key to whether or not even Stepovy, if the Ukrainians would be able to hold, because it actually gave the Russians the high ground. They could use it to launch attacks. They have used it to launch attacks. But then, bizarrely, even yesterday, Ukrainians seem to be back on Terrakon, then not on Terrakon. You kind of, maybe you don't want to sit on top of Terrakon because you get shelled or droned or hit. But maybe that's more disputed than we think. That's like kind of one of these, it's not trivial, but it's one of these kind of interesting little factoids that we follow in the war, and very strange, very strange. Deepstate UA looks like the Russians have taken it. That's probably what has happened, but it seems like the Ukrainians, at least they make raids, they battle to get back on top of it. So maybe that story is not yet over. Now, what we want to do, go down, we're going to jump all the way down from Avdiivka, and you see you've got these other cities. You got Marinki, you got Vuhledar, you got Velkonovoselivka. That's where we're talking about Staromayorsk. Very quickly, the Russians are still launching attacks, but from what I can tell and what I've read and what I've seen, what I've heard, these are maybe not raids, but they're kind of like jabs. They're probing attacks. Not a whole lot going on there. Staromayorsk, I'm just showing you this map. There's not much going on there. There was hope at one time. The whole Staromayorsk, Urozhainy story, etc. Not much is going on there. I think that both sides have petered out for now. Now, let's go to Robotnya. The Robotnya story continues to just kind of rumble on. It looks like on both sides we've hit a bit of a stalemate. I'm bringing it up for the simple fact that the Ukrainians maybe have not given up, but we kept expecting to hear that the Ukrainians would make a big push, probably towards Verbove, with armor. Leopards, Challengers, whatever. There were some reports of this happening a couple weeks back, but then not that much came out of it. This may be, in part, it goes back to two things. One, if we go to the next map, you see where Robotnya is. And you see this is on the western edge of that kind of agglomeration. But you see where the heart of Robotnya is, and you've got Novoprokopivka that the Ukrainians were pushing to take, and maybe took a little bit of it. Way over to, if we go east, you've got Verbove. Now, there's two things. One, we've got the trench lines, the Surovikin lines. The other thing is, again, this is very similar to Avdiivka, is you see that road. That's the road that the Ukrainians need to use, kind of have to use, try to get reinforcements, armor, whatever they want, to the front line, to that Novoprokopivka front line. Right to the west of that, you've got the Russians, and we talked about this before. You see to the west, and you got Kompania, that they just use that. They use that side. They push on that side, and they shell that road, and that just seems to be holding things up. But if we jump back out, I want you to take a look at this. These are the fortifications on the Russian side. Now you see where it says 7th Airborne Assault Division. I only put that there because if you go straight, well, kind of actually southeast of that, you've got Tokmak. You can't read Tokmak because you've got the different Russian groups. Those diamonds are sitting on top of it. But I put that there so you know where that was. if you take a look at where Novoprokopivka is, and you see these lines and these fortifications, we know the Russians have been still bolstering these ever since the Ukrainians started to make progress there. You see how difficult that is. But just so you understand this, because you guys can get on Deepstate UA. I know maybe a lot of you don't have the time, and that's why you get on the show and you take a look at the show and you follow this. But you see this color meter, which gives you an idea of what's going on. So you've got trenches, dragging seeds, but you got, like they call them moats, and then other, but there's in between these, you got minefields. This looks like a hard go. I just don't see how it's going to get anywhere, especially now after the Ukrainians have used so much effort, manpower, weapons, everything to try to make progress. But that's not the end of the story. Take a look at the next map. And I left the Russian 7th Airborne Assault Division up there so you can see where Tokmak is, and then you see Kherson, okay? Just to give you guys, like I said, I had a guy write in and say he was getting a bit disoriented when he looked at the maps. Now, let's go down to Kherson, okay? And I want to show you the difference. You saw that map with all those trench lines, the Sirovikin lines, etc. Let's go down to Kherson, okay? First, before I show you the trench lines and all that, this is Kherson, okay? And you see just across from Kherson, you've got Pishchanivka, but then you go up Kozachi Laher. We talked about there was an attempt a couple of months back. The Ukrainians had a little foothold, then got droned and bombed and had to pull out there. And then you've got this arrow, and I hope it fits on the page. You've got Krynki. Krynki is where there's a lot happening right now, and it could be quite serious. Let's jump to Krynki and talk about what is happening there first, and then I'm going to show you a bit more. So if you take a look at Krynki, okay, and you see that this big gray area on the other side, and all the way to Kozachi Laher, and that even goes down further. That's not going to come as a surprise. What is interesting, though, is that literally yesterday, the Ukrainian, the spokesman for the Ukrainian General Staff came out and said, yeah, we are making progress there, even up to 8 kilometers. The Ukrainians, and man, just amazing. These guys are something else. They're getting men across. They're getting equipment across. Even 4 or 5 days ago, the Russians were coming out and maybe they were finally admitting that the Ukrainians had a foothold there, but they were saying, man, we just got like fiery death prepared for them. And the stories that you were hearing is that, okay, the Ukrainians did get across, but they're hiding in basements under rubble. They're getting shelled. They're getting droned. They're taking mortars all the time. There's not much hope. Well, maybe, as amazing as it sounds, through sheer force of will probably, they actually have managed to make some gains here, to the point that according to the Ukrainian military, is they're actually managed to push the Russians back so that their guys immediately across the river are not getting mortared. That's remarkable, which means that maybe there's something here. Now, I want you to take a look at this next map, okay, which is backing up just a tiny bit, but it shows Kherson, and that arrow up there, that's where Krynki is. Now, you see where the lines are? All the Russian lines, the fortifications, these are these little dots, right? Obviously, this is nothing like the Surovikin lines that you see up at Robotnia. This is why there is some hope that the Ukrainians could actually make progress here, because they get across. If they actually get significant amounts of weapons and armor and everything across, they might be able to make a run. This is not something that we can take lightly. In fact, even from the side of the Ukrainians are saying, look, this is not that that this is an easy go. There are tens of thousands of Russians on that side, and they're being reinforced. They're not putting it lightly, but this, I want to end on an up note. If anything, just to be in awe of what the Ukrainian military has done here, because it really is something else. What does this mean over the long term? The cynic in me thinks that actually we're still in for a stalemate, but if you're going to have a stalemate and you might be forced into negotiations, maybe sheerly through the fact that the West is not going to supply enough money and weapons, which could be a reality, you want to be in a strong position and have some success, which is why I think right now we're seeing intense battles up in Kupiansk, but also down here with the Ukrainians in Kherson. So I'm back. This is me. Not going to keep plagiarizing Aussie man. This has been the three things. I hope that you found that interesting, fascinating. I hope you come back. I don't know what my hat looks like. I hope that I feel better for next week. But come back next week. And again, like and subscribe. Feel free to write in. Take a look at the newest edition of the magazine on www.thecorners.pl. There's a lot to read there. I put up more stuff all the time. My magical little helpers across the region, thank you guys. I'm not going to name you, but thanks a lot. I do appreciate when I can call you up and get insight, and there will be more insight to come. Otherwise, over and out. Speak soon. Cześć, do widzenia, na sklenedo. Bye-bye, adios, and see you in a week.